Oh, jeez. So sorry, I was just thinking about Dune Prophecy and oh, that's embarrassing. Yeah, I've been watching Dune Prophecy. It's at best, like, it might have a couple scenes here or there that I think are okay. Like, at the absolute best. It's kind of lame, but I did notice something when I was recently watching it. I mean, it's something I knew, but this feels like the most obvious example of it. HBO is desperate for a new Game of Thrones. And it's not just them. Ever since the original run of Game of Thrones ended, the world of fantasy adaptations has never really been the same. You see, this show was such a phenomenon, and it became such a pop culture juggernaut that everyone wanted in on it. I'm not going to be discussing the quality of the later seasons of Game of Thrones. I've made videos on that before. But putting that aside, like, you cannot deny the insane amount of popularity that show achieved. And as soon as it ended, we just saw everyone trying to get into that, newly vacant spot in the market. Fantasy shows were being greenlit and produced like crazy. But here we are now, about 5 years removed from all that, and how are things going? It seems that the quote-unquote next Game of Thrones that everyone was trying to find has still yet to be found, and it's starting to look like the search may be slowing down, as the current state of fantasy adaptations is kinda cooked. But in order to understand why, we need to understand what led us here. Game of Thrones was kind of crazy, because stuff like it never really existed. Before it was much more popular for fantasy novels to, get adapted into films. Of course, Lord of the Rings kind of popularized the whole thing, and, throughout the 2000s, much like is happening with Game of Thrones, a bunch of people were trying to make their own Lord of the Rings. And that also didn't really work. But movies are kind of a separate thing we're leaving behind in the past, because today, of course, it's all about streaming shows. But Game of Thrones, was this adaptation of this popular book series that was of extremely high quality. Obviously, there were fantasy shows before Game of Thrones, even ones based off books, but they never had just the star power, the production value, the, effects value, and it showed people that, TV series might be the way to go for these, fantasy epics. They attempted to turn so many books into movies, but it always failed because it was just really hard to condense some of these stories. And even looking at Lord of the Rings, like, you can only properly adapt it if they were all over 3 hours long. And that's very expensive. The studios would have to be taking a huge gamble on it. Game of Thrones presented sort of an alternate way to do things, and it proved to be extremely successful. But something people often forget is that Game of Thrones was also a big gamble, and didn't blow up right from the start. The first season averaged, less than 3 million views? You might think that's a lot. Okay, here's how much the first season of Young Sheldon got. These are baby numbers, okay? Game of Thrones continues on, it becomes very popular on streaming, people binging it. Massive boost in the numbers, this is the type of stuff studios like to see. What they don't like to see is Game of Thrones Season 1 level numbers, especially for a show that is so big and so expensive. Albeit it was much less expensive at the very beginning. So when studios look at Game of Thrones and they're like, okay, we want our own Game of Thrones, they are looking at these numbers. Not these numbers. What do you mean most good shows, start relatively small and grow a large audience over time? No, we're not doing that. We are going to take as much money as we possibly can and pump it into this new project so we can immediately get those Game of Thrones Season 7 numbers. And right away, you can kind of see the issue of this. So many shows, man. Rings of Power, The Witcher, Wheel of Time, Shadow and Bone, of course, Dune Prophecy. All series that are taking properties that are already very popular, loading a ton of money into them, and just trying to recapture, this big pop culture moment that Game of Thrones was. And while a lot of these are successful by most metrics, none of them are really coming close. None of them are connecting the way Game of Thrones did. Because a lot of them ignore why Game of Thrones got to the level it did. This would not exist without this. It was this slow build-up of mystery, intrigue that Game of Thrones had. If you remember, it was not very action-packed intact from the beginning. The huge, giant, epic battles and dragon fights that it was known for didn't really exist until near the end of the series, and studios now just want to rush into that. But the issue is that that is very expensive, and it also takes a lot of time to make. A very unfortunate and frustrating trend we have been seeing with, big TV series in the past decade is where we used to get, like 20 episode seasons of stuff coming out every single year. Now it's a lot more common to see about 8 episodes every 2 years, if you're lucky. They all have movie-level budgets and effects, so they are going to take more time. But when you do that, you risk a lot of what made TV so popular to begin with. It always sucked when the season of Game of Thrones ended on a big cliffhanger, but you knew you only had to wait another year. Now you get to the end of a Stranger Things season, and you're like, okay, alright, I'll see you when I'm 30. It's not really in the same vein as these shows I'm talking about, but the fact that the Wednesday Addams show is going to have a 3-year gap between season 1 and 2, when it's literally just like a slightly higher budget CW show, is absolutely ridiculous. But what these long gaps do is they kill interest, man. We see it time and time again. And these shows really can't afford people losing interest. Like, we look at Rings of Power, okay? Rings of Power, it does respectable numbers, okay? But it's also the most expensive show ever made. And that's probably why it has yet to be renewed for season 3. I still think that will probably happen. But they're probably sweating, because I do not know if they're making a return on investment with that thing. And there's also the issue where Game of Thrones was so popular, like, people are trying to make all these other properties that aren't Game of Thrones feel more like Game of Thrones. Like, I watched a few episodes of the Wheel of Time show when it first came out, and, like, I was kind of shocked at how much more adult it was. Like, there's so much more sex and violence and these dark themes that I didn't really associate with the Wheel of Time. It felt very odd. The same, I think, is true for Dune Prophecy. It's really affected the content of TV shows, and I don't always know if that's for the best. So now we have a ton of very expensive shows that lots of people are watching, but not as many people are watching. And when the studios have set Game of Thrones high expectations, well, they're in trouble. We're going to have to start canceling things that got pretty good viewership, and we're going to have to start significantly scaling back. And as a fan who, wants to see my favorite books get adapted, this sucks. I can't stand Hollywood, man. They're idiots. You know why a Mistborn movie hasn't happened yet? I'm gonna be real with you. Brandon Sanderson has been talking about it for years and years and years. There's always rumors of stuff happening, but nothing ever does. It's because of this, okay? It's because of the Dungeons & Dragons movie. I think this movie's awesome. Most people who saw the movie thought it was awesome, but no one saw the movie. Because studios have spent the last half a decade pumping us with so much fantasy slop, when stuff comes out that is new, creative, exciting, based on already popular franchises, people don't care, because fantasy's out right now. And studios look at this and they're like, okay, well, we're obviously not going to fund a Mistborn movie. It could flop. And yeah, it could flop, even if it's good. It's just the hard truth, but, they just don't want anything to do with it. Which is why most of the ones still going are, based on properties that have made a name for themselves outside of books already. So we're getting endless Game of Thrones spin-offs, endless Lord of the Rings spin-offs. They're probably going to try to make more Dune spin-offs. Brian Herbert has so many books. Oh my god, oh, kill me. And the Harry Potter show, I won't say much, I'll just say I hate everything about this. I can't even, don't get me started. And it frustrates me because, like, this didn't need to happen. There were so many different ways they could have gone to actually make the next Game of Thrones, and I have several series in mind that would have worked perfectly. The First Law here? The First Law? Hello? Now, they are trying to make a Best Served Cold movie. We'll see if it actually happens. I really hope it does. But, it was clear the reasoning that they're doing Best Served Cold is because they know that the First Law trilogy is a slow burn character story. If you start a series based on the Blade itself, you're not going to get to the huge epic battles until several seasons in. It's going to be a lot of talking and politics, and that stuff's boring. That's not stuff people want to see. That's like some Game of Thrones type. Right, hey, wait a minute. Well, that's how Game of Thrones started. Well, wasn't it? And it didn't get crazy until later because they gave it time to grow and build a fan base. And kill me. Also, the Realm of the Elderlings, I think, is perfect. Like, every studio should be jumping on that one, because not only could it actually work with, you know, the long gaps between seasons of modern shows, because there's long gaps throughout the story, but you could also fill like the off-season years with like a live ship trader show. Hello? Both of these series would be far less to produce than the later seasons of Game of Thrones. But it is too late, because instead we had to do this nonsense Witcher show that didn't follow the books, pissed off all the fans, pissed off the main actor, so he left, completely imploded upon itself. And then when people stop watching it, it's because, of course, fantasy is not popular anymore. Now, a lot of nerds, myself included, you know, look at a lot of these books we want to see adapted. Honestly, most specifically Stormlight. I mean, come on, it's what everyone talks about with Stormlight. We want to see this stuff animated, okay? It would be so easy. So easy. Animation is where it's at. Not only is it far cheaper to produce, but there are no limits. You can get so much farther with animation than you can with live action stuff. And quite frankly, I think something like Stormlight would work way better in animation anyway. But us animation fans have to face the hard truth, okay? If Game of Thrones were the exact same show but animated, no one would watch it. All of us would watch it, all of us would love it, and it would probably like run for as long as it could, because animation is so much cheaper. But the threshold of viewership that animation gets is far lower than live action. We look at the most popular like adult animated shows out today, Arcane, Invincible. These shows do not come close in viewership to the most popular live action shows, and that's why people don't really opt to go for animation most of the time. And because Hollywood is gonna Hollywood, we got War of the Rohirrim out right now. Do you care about this movie? I certainly don't. People do not care about this movie, and Hollywood's gonna look at this like, okay, animated adaptations of big fantasy epics, that's a no. People do not want to see that. There's no instance where that will work. Fantasy is dead. Harry Potter, save us. You know, I think something's going to have to break eventually. I think eventually we are going to see the next Game of Thrones. I just don't really see it happening in this current state. And that kind of sucks. Because, you know, I know if there were a first law show, it could be as big as Game of Thrones. It could probably be even better than Game of Thrones if they actually adapt the full story. But it's too high a risk for Hollywood. They'd much rather just go with something safer, even though it's probably not actually safe, and it'll probably end up doing bad because they're going to spend $300 million on it. I don't know what to do. I'm just a guy, okay? Thank you all for watching my rant. Leave your thoughts in the comments down below. Going on vacation now, so I have a few videos pre-recorded. There's going to be the tier list, and then I'm going to have the big annual TBR video at the start of January, a couple shorts as well. But for now, I'm going to go watch the next episode of Dune Prophecy. Because if I don't watch it, we'll never get that adaptation of Paul of Dune. Am I right? We live in a dystopia.